Look at the camera. The excuse of
Okay, thank you all for being here for our final panel today. The topic is interventions, and I'm glad to be able to moderate this panel because this is a topic that comes up with students often in the Critical Race Studies program. So, for example, last semester teaching race and sexuality, after class a couple of times students would stop me and, for example, say like, well, wow, professor, like this is great. We talked about romantic preferences and sort of racial aspects of those, and the student might say, well, that's really problematic that a lot of people accept the fact that everybody has racial preferences in dating, but what do we do about it? And that's when I sort of pause, and I try to come up with a law professor way of saying, I don't know. And you learn lots of ways of saying that. I'm kind of giving away the secrets, unfortunately, ruining it for my colleagues as well. But the point is that oftentimes we focus on sort of deconstructing dominant standards, and we don't spend as much time figuring out how to propose alternatives. And so we're trying to focus with this panel, we're trying to avoid falling into that trap and trying to sketch out some ways in which we can begin to operationalize the rich insights that we've heard the last couple of days. So I'm going to start with a little bit of work that I've done sort of personally just over the last couple of days, and hopefully it will open up the discussion that we have with this panel. So I attended Hampton University, a historically black college in Southern Virginia, and since I was a poli-sci major, of course, I went to law school. And in January of I guess this is my senior year, I got a letter of acceptance from Harvard Law School. And I was excited about this. I went to my job where I worked at a part-time job as a waiter at a bar and grill. And I went into the kitchen and told my all-white coworkers, I got into Harvard Law School. And most of them were excited for me, slapped me on the back, congratulations. One, however, a white woman said, I'm against affirmative action. Then she went on to tell me that her best friend was denied admission to Stanford because she was Asian instead of black. And I kind of thought, well, maybe because she was Asian instead of white, but, and years later, I had another sort of similar experience. And I think that probably a lot of people of color have had these experiences as well, where there's sort of an accusation made that sort of, by our mere presence in elite institutions, we have violated colorblind norms. So years later, I was clerking at the U.S. Supreme Court, and this attack came from sort of the other end of the political spectrum. So early on in my year, clerking for Justice Breyer, I had lunch with a group of multiracial group of liberal clerks. My year featured the most diverse group of law clerks ever at the Supreme Court, at least at that time. There were 7 people of color that were clerking, including 2 African Americans. So during lunch, one clerk asked whether the NAACP's protests of the Supreme Court's lack of diversity in hiring had made any real difference. And a white colleague who styled himself as the most liberal clerk at the court replied, well, look around. And then he looked at me and the other clerks of color and said, isn't it obvious? So I can't recall exactly, and I thought about this a lot over the last 24 hours, exactly how I responded. I'm pretty sure I didn't have any sort of quick rebuttal. I was probably so taken aback by the comment that it took me a minute to sort of absorb and figure out how to respond. But I think that one aspect of my response, or perhaps lack of response, was an acquiescence to a colorblind norm. And I thought about this when I was listening to my colleague Kim Crenshaw's powerful talk yesterday. Kim's statement that she benefited from affirmative action in UCLA's hiring process made manifest my own reticence to acknowledge that I might very well have gotten into Harvard Law School because in part of race. So rather than accept the notion that affirmative action is a source of shame and that we should sort of hide that or sort of deny it, I could have used these moments to call into question the colorblind construction of merit that provided the foundation for these attacks. As Kimberly West-Faulcon will discuss shortly, standardized tests are relatively weak predictors of future academic success. Thus, it's wrong to assume that affirmative action is a deviation from race-neutral, merit-based criteria. Rather, a properly implemented affirmative action plan might embrace a fuller, more accurate understanding of merit. It's also interesting that the fact that sort of 10 years after graduating from law school, I would have any anxiety about whether my LSAT score was good enough speaks volumes, I think, as to the hegemonic nature of standardized tests in terms of how we think about merit and intelligence. Right? They're supposed to predict how well you'll do in your first year of law school. Well, after you've done well in law school, after you succeeded as a lawyer and as a professor, the fact that you would still be concerned about something that's simply supposed to predict your performance in your first year of law school says a lot about, I think, the role that these tests have assumed, which is a rather large and inflated role, I would say. Similarly, Kim's disclosure that she may have benefited from affirmative action says little about her merit and much more about UCLA's hiring standards. If a groundbreaking scholar such as Kim Crenshaw could have slipped through the cracks of UCLA's hiring process, if not for affirmative action, then surely it's time to reconsider UCLA's standards. So I offer this personal epiphany as a sort of a micro-level intervention against colorblindness, which Kim performed whether she intended it or not. And she taught me to sort of come out as a potential beneficiary of affirmative action. Different type of coming out. I know the other type as well. My hope is that our panelists will give us additional specific interventions, both at the individual and structural level. I'll ask them to answer the following questions, which are aimed at sort of making sure that we have some concrete proposals that come out of this, although I realize that there's some challenges in terms of trying to squeeze them out of the science, perhaps. So I'm going to ask you to identify at least one specific intervention based on your research or that of other scholars at this symposium, first. And then second, what can people at the symposium do today to start making that intervention a reality? And this might be in their capacity as an employee, a manager, a parent, a voter, all sorts of different roles that we might play in society. But how can we actually start to make a change today? So I'm going to, without further ado, give very brief bios of our panelists. The full bios are in the program. I hope you will read them. I'm just going to give you the bare bones, and then I'm going to turn it over to them to get the discussion going. So first, Richard Brooks is professor of law at Yale Law School. He also has a PhD in economics from Berkeley. Michele Landis Dauber is a professor of law and Bernard D. Bergreen faculty scholar at Stanford University. She also has an appointment by courtesy with the Stanford University Department of Sociology. Eric Knowles is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and Social Behavior at the University of California, Irvine. Brian Lowrey is co-presenting with him, and he is an associate professor of organizational behavior at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Margaret Shih is an associate professor in human resources and organizational behavior at the UCLA Anderson School of Management. And finally, Kimberly West-Faulcon is an associate professor of law at Loyola Law School. And prior to joining the Loyola faculty, Professor West-Faulcon was the Western Regional Director of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our esteemed panel.
So, thank you. I'm going to try to answer the two questions that you proposed for us. First, my intervention is going to be to suggest a notion of connectivity. Originally, and I'm going to run out of time, so I'll just get as much out as I can, and I'll stop at a weird point, wherever it happens. Originally, the title of this was Groups and Individuals, and it was sort of tapping into Jerry's earlier question about the right level. But I'm going to end up with not about groups or individuals, but about a structure. And the structure is connectivity and what value it has for us. So let me put up this first slide. This is a figure that I took from a paper by Bob Putnam. He did this last year, and it was in a piece where he makes the argument that diversity causes distrust and social breakdown, leads people to watch more television, vote less, volunteer less, and do all of these other sort of social ills. And so for me, this is sort of the standard problem of identification. It's a correlation, and somehow he goes from a simple correlation to thinking in terms of causation. By the way, let me just explain what this means. On the This is a tape recorder to point. So this is the level of racial homogeneity in a census tract. He used the census tracts. Census tracts are regions that have roughly 5,000 people. It's really defined somewhat by natural boundaries, but principally by the number of people. So in Chicago, or a census tract can be a single block. In South Dakota, it could be 30 miles. And that gives you a different notion of the construct of this idea of neighborhood. When we're talking about what it means to be neighbors, and that neighbor is right on top of you or right next to you versus 10 or 30 miles away, there's a lot of variation there that's not being accounted for. But the way you should interpret this is if you were to pull two people at random out of this geography, what's the probability that they would be of the same race or ethnicity? So if it's close to 100%, like in rural South Dakota, that they'd be the same race, then it's a very homogeneous, obviously, setting. And then here we are right here in Los Angeles, less than 50, a little bit more than 50%. San Francisco, Oakland, less than 50%. So if you look at that, that they would be of the same race or ethnicity. So if you look at that, then it turns out that there's this very predictable pattern between an absence of diversity and increasing levels of trust. I did another study using a database on Chicago 9th and 10th graders, looking at their perceptions of trust. And it turns out that as Chicago schools become more diverse, and in Chicago that means as the percent white goes up, because it's only about 10% of the public school population in Chicago that's white. But as more white students come into the schools, the black students and Hispanic students report more racial injustice. The same exact correlation where it would be as diversity increases, perceptions of racial injustice increase. Similar to this result. Now, you always have to worry about studies that find this correlation because, for the most part, we don't know why those students in Chicago ended up where they are. We don't know why the people in rural South Dakota chose to be in a homogeneous setting. We have to imagine how you might control for that. I did a really simple intervention, luckily because of Chicago, before parents involved. The way Chicago administered its diversity was that if anyone could go to a different school from which they were assigned, and roughly 50% of the students in Chicago chose to go to a different school than the one that they're assigned. When the demand for particular schools are greater than the seats that are available, sometimes there's testing, but more often there's a lottery that's done. And you can just do a simple analysis. Take everyone that entered the lottery to go to a school, look at the lottery winners and the lottery losers to schools that are more diverse, and see if the perception, this correlation remains. It doesn't when you do that. It completely goes away. This is sort of the gold standard approach of trying to identify effects. But even that is problematic, and I'll talk about that. For instance, it might just be that there's an effect of winning the lottery. Winning the lottery may lead you to think that the world is more fair. So we ultimately can't fully control for that. But here's what I really want us to think about. This is my census tract. It's in New Haven. Right over here at the bottom is Yale Science Hill. My census tract is incredibly diverse. It's got about 1/3, about 33% black, 40% white, about 18% Asian, and the remaining other largely Hispanic. Incredible. If you were just to think about diversity, you would see a tremendous amount. We would be way up on the standard. We'd be very close to the San Francisco, level. However, how much interaction do we have in my census tract? Not very much. These are contour lines, and they represent 3-meter inclines, each line. So basically, I live on a big hill, and all of the white people are here, all of the Asians are here, and all of the black people are here. There's a public school right here, and you see, if you watch people in the mornings walking they'll walk their kids up to this point and walk back. There's a very good private school right here, and you'll see all the people over here walk their kids up here and back. There's very little interaction. And this is something that you see that ecologists, it's a framework that ecologists use of connectivity, where they look at habitat patches. And two habitat patches that are right next to each other may have very little interaction because they're disconnected in some way. Whereas two patches that are very far apart, where there's connectivity between the two, will have tremendous interactions. So if you think about geography and space without accounting for connectivity, you'll really miss the real neighborhood effects. In my neighborhood, these are all the trees on in my census tract. We measured at breast height their diameter, and we know what kind of tree they are, so we can calculate the canopy cover, which means on nice spring days, it's a really beautiful tree-lined street, and there's a lot of walking up and down these streets, lots of neighborhood interactions. Also over here, again, no one is going across because the trees aren't very dense, and this may just, I'm not saying it's intentional, it may just be the way that we're trying to figure out why. There was actually a hurricane that ripped up a few of these trees, and we're tracking those trees. But this is another way of just thinking about how the spatial connectivity might also affect interaction. Okay, how am I doing? 2 minutes? Okay, so I wanted to think about connectivity more broadly, and I've been looking at behaviors on beaches, and I'm going to try to fly through this really quickly, and I'll clarify in the question and answer period. This is actually a beach in Yale. Lots of structure there. We don't have those beaches, and this makes it really kind of nice. One of the problems in studying interactions is that the structure is there for you. Someone else has made many of the decisions, but in open space, you can identify decisions and choices that individuals make. So I looked at on Martha's Vineyard. There's a black community, well-known black community here in this area called Oak Bluffs. This beach over here is known as the Inkwell. Here's another set of beaches, State Beach that I studied, and then a third set of beaches, South Beach. That's one of my research assistants. He's walking up and down the beach with this tremble. It will measure will measure your location with 2 to 5 meters degree of accuracy. We actually can get it more accurate, but there are federal regulations prohibiting identification. So we used this data set, or we used this and we generated. That research assistant, for instance, Justin walked up and down. He was recording the race of individuals, their apparent gender and race, their apparent age, adult status, teen, and so forth, the number of people in their cluster, their activity, and so forth. These points represent, again, roughly where they are. And one of the really interesting things that comes out of this, and maybe 30 seconds, I'll end with this slide. One of the really interesting things that comes out of this is if you think about diversity, and here's why diversity, I want to argue, may not be such a useful construct for us, and maybe integration might not also be so useful. So this is the Black Beach, the Inkwell. South Beach is really mainly the White Beach, and State Beach. If you look at the clusters, these are clusters of more than one. These are the number of clusters that are diverse. By the way, if you were just to look at diversity, you would see that on the Inkwell, the diversity is incredibly large. Diversity, though, doesn't tell you anything about interactions. Diversity is a necessary condition for segregation. You can't have segregation if you don't have diverse populations. So diversity isn't doing anything for us. You really have to imagine, maybe we can think about integration, this idea that there are 56 of the 477 clusters that are integrated, or about 11%. That's useful. That's bringing us more. But there are a lot of people go to the beach with their families, and therefore will not necessarily be integrated. If you really want the real distinction, what was interesting when you look at the behaviors here was that at the Inkwell, people were talking across what are called umbrella spaces, across clusters. There were mechanisms in place that facilitated connectivity between clusters. So the richest, and you just didn't see that at these other places. Everyone at the other places, they stayed in their tight little clusters. Sometimes at these other beaches, children, they always violated boundaries. And that was a source of connectivity. So then families would talk. So there are other things that would produce connectivity, but there was something really distinctive about what was going on at the Ecole. Now, again, we don't know if it's causal because people may choose to go to the Ecole because they have these preferences. That is, there may be a select stop. Will you stop embarrassing me? There may be a selection effect where there are certain types of people who know that they're going to have the opportunities to interact these ways. But if we want to talk about a possible intervention, I think we need to move away from ideas of diversity, because diversity won't help us any. Again, it's just as consistent with segregation as it is with integration. Integration by itself isn't bad. It's not a bad goal, but it's not necessarily the optimal goal. We don't think we necessarily need to integrate families if they don't want to. In fact, if they want to, fine. But the big impact we might be able to make, the big intervention, is by thinking about structures, physical structures, social structures, that would lead to more meaningful integrations. And how could you do it? Just connect. That's what I suggest. Just connect. Just do something that breaks the structural norms that allows for, and sometimes that requires a lot of bravery, and people will look at you strangely, but you'll actually connect, and that's my proposal. Yes.
Who wants to be Rick's research assistant? You can go to the vineyard and the little things or something. Yes, pretty cool. Okay, so how do I, sorry.
No, I don't want to play the type, but I will.
I can do it, I understand now. Okay, so I got all excited about how everybody was talking about Obama yesterday. So I decided I had a picture, everybody had a picture, and so I went home to the hotel last night and I decided that I needed a picture of Obama too, but the other Obama. Because because Michele Obama, unlike Barack Obama, went to work in a law firm after she graduated from law school. She went to Sidley and Austin, which is a big white shoe firm in Chicago. And what I'm going to talk about is a project that I started with my students at Stanford Law School to help women like Michele Obama and men of color as well, sexual minorities, to become successful, that is to be promoted within large law firms, because there's terrible discrimination, ongoing inequality within these institutions. So I want to talk about that project. Okay, so the project is called Building a Better Legal Profession, and it was started at Stanford, like I said, in conjunction with some of my students in 2007. And this is a law student movement that's aimed at collective action for workplace reform in large elite law firms. And the core issues of the movement are gender, parenthood, race, sexual orientation, discrimination within internal labor markets in these large-scale law firms. So all of these firms have internal labor markets for promotion. The external labor markets have responded to pressure for diversification. So the external labor markets have functioned. They have recruited a lot of people of color. They have recruited a lot of women. Women make up about half of the entering associates. That's white women and women of color. Make up about half of the entering associates in large law firms, and there's still work to do with minority lawyers, with lawyers of color, but by and large the external labor markets are working okay at the entry level. The internal labor markets for promotion are not producing equality. The strategy of BBLP is to use transparency to mobilize labor and other market forces for change. So what the observation was that students at the very top schools like UCLA and like Stanford are highly desirable candidates to large elite law firms. Now, all this is happening in real time, right? Because, watch this space. There's all these layoffs, and I can talk about that in a minute if I have time left. at least in 2007, the idea was there's this war for talent going on. The firms are deeply competitive with each other. The MLA 100, MLA 200, NLJ 250, these big, big firms, they're very competitive. They don't want to lose any competitive advantage. And the evidence of that is the way entry-level salaries have skyrocketed, right? $160,000, who wants a booze cruise? Who wants some free Knicks tickets? Who wants, right? So students are collecting all this stuff that they don't care about. And they come to me and they're like, well, what do I do? And I'm like, you don't care about Knicks tickets. You care about breastfeeding, right? You don't know it because you're 22. But believe me, what you really care about is breastfeeding. So that's what you want, right? Is you want a bargain for that. So could we take, and not only that, right? Not only could we take these elite students who are having all this crap they don't want showered on them and say, bargain for what you want for your interests, would they, and this is the key question, would white, male, elite, desirable, sought-after students at elite law schools be willing to make sacrifices to their own short-term personal interests to bargain for something altruistic? That is to say, bargain for increased equality in the internal labor markets of these firms. Would they say, thank you very much, and here I think the next slide helps us understand. This is Blank Rome. This is a New York firm. They're actually the worst firm in New York on the diversity scale. So this is our website. If you go to our website, betterlegalprofession.org, you can look at the markets. So you can see you have all these different ways to search rank firms in Manhattan by the percentage of female lawyers, right? And that's a drop-down menu. And, you know, black, Hispanic, Asian, gay. And actually this year you're going to be able to fine grain it even more, black female, black male, Hispanic male. But last year we didn't have the internet power to do that. So anyway, this is this firm. Look, F, F, D, F, 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 F. The only thing they get an A in is for having half their associates be female, which is like, why is that not a big deal? Why should we give them no credit for that? That grade shouldn't even be in there, honestly, because there's basically no diversity within that. There's no variation within that range because half of all entering law students are female. So big deal, okay? Everywhere it counts, F, 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 F. Okay, all right, I used half my time. Okay, so here we are. So this is a serious problem, and the website introduces an interactive dynamic tool. Would you be able to persuade this, you know, hypothetical law review editor to say, thank you very much, Blank Rome, I'm very flattered by your interest in me. However, I'll be going to Cleary Gottlieb because Cleary Gottlieb got an A from Better Legal Profession for Diversity and you got an F. You know, let me know if you decide to make any black partners and I'll come back. Right. Would people do this? Okay. So, and we have a bunch of cool stuff going on the website, so take a look. Okay. The idea is that we want to steer students toward those firms with the best values of inclusion, the best, not just diversity, but integrated work groups, the best bottom line numbers, at least as a first cut. What we want to do is take students away from the glossy marketing materials and the, you know, diversity speak about the affinity groups and refocus their attention on whatever you're doing, is it working? Right? Whatever you're doing, is it working? Because when you show law firms these numbers, they say, well, numbers aren't everything. Right? But they're not nothing either. Okay, all right. So we've had a lot of stories. We've had a lot of media attention. New York Times, LA Times. This is the San Francisco Attorney Magazine. Recently, I'm going to start talking fast now. And the media positioning of the group is, you know, this is the students grade firms. Little guy stands up to the man. You know, of course, you know, you're the future man. You're 5 minutes from the man, but okay, you know, it's fine. Future man stands up to present man, whatever. Okay. And 2008, we had a major organizing push. We got some money from a donor, and students went on, the student leaders at Stanford went on a 20 law school organizing tour where they went all over the country and planted chapters at the top 20 law schools. And we're actually bringing the leaders of those chapters to Stanford next month for a national student leadership conference where we're having the Writers Guild of America and SEIU come in and do a weekend of training with the leaders from all over the country about how to organize professional workers. Okay, so we're doing a big organizing push, and we have a book coming out. Go to Amazon, not now, but after April 3rd, and buy our book, which is, again, takes the what's on the website and surrounds it with a lot of other material, including the charts, and so we're trying to hit the book market here, too. We have swag. Which you can buy on our website and also donate. Okay. So I taught a class at Stanford for that was requested by the students, leadership of the group, about this topic, and I'm not going to make it, but I get it. Okay. The idea was, and it was huge. It was oversubscribed. There were 30 students, and there was a waiting list to get into this class to work on this issue, and that's where the book came from. We wrote the book in the class. So let me just talk. In the class, the students decided what issues we were going to cover. One of them was internal labor markets. One of them was how to make connections with clients, and I think that's really crucial in this market. Right? Clients have a whole rhetoric. Corporate clients, just forget what they do, okay? I don't endorse what they do, just forget what they do, okay? When you're organizing the workers at Ford, you don't tell them they shouldn't be making cars, okay? If you're organizing lawyers, don't tell them they shouldn't be working for corporate America. So just bracket whatever feelings you have about that, okay? So clients, including Walmart, have a very big commitment to the diversity of the lawyers that they hire. Because, okay, we could do a whole critique, right? They want to put a black or brown face on the terrible thing they're doing. But they do want to do that, right? And in this market, where the market power of students is declining, if you are a paying client and you have work, your power is going up. So what do we need to do? We need to connect with those clients, and we need to get those clients to help us in our struggle. So we covered connections with clients, we covered market power of students, and we covered internal labor markets. And so this is, if you went to our firm, into our site, and you said, I want to see how black people are doing, lawyers in Boston, and notice we have a male and female column there, so you can sort of suss it out yourself. The first thing you notice is bad, okay? How are we doing? Bad, okay? That's how we're doing. You can see that half of Boston firms have no black partners, and in fact, an overlapping half have no Hispanic partners. And you can actually see that there's a fair number of Boston firms that have no black associates, so they have no internal labor market, okay, for promotion. Okay, so I was going to talk about an investigation we did that actually looks at, this is women in New York, and what we were doing here was we were studying something called non-equity partnership. So this is sort of taking this to another level. After this came out, a friend of mine who works at Wachtell Lipton said, this is great, I know, this is great, but what you're doing is you're conflating equity and non-equity partners. And oftentimes what they call non-equity partners is like the mommy track or the Asian track is another way they refer to it. These are derogatory terms that if you talk to people in the law firm world, you'll hear. So this is ridiculous because you're not being fair, because a lot of these people aren't really partners, but the firms are calling them partners. So we decided to try to find that out. These are the ones that are lying about what a partner means. So we have a new thing coming out this year, and I know I'm not doing a good job explaining this because of time constraints, but basically these are firms. We did a big investigation, and what we found in my class was that these are the ones that are red are firms that have told conflicting things to various publications about who is a partner at the firm. Okay, so we found that about a third of New York firms are lying about what's an equity partner. 25% of DC firms are not telling the truth. 56% of New York firms that claim that all their partners are equity are not truthful about the existence or number of non-equity partners. The errors aren't random, and I don't have time to explain to you what that means, but we can do it in questions and answers. And these are examples of the deceptive practices that they're doing. And I'm using the term deceptive practices with intention because that's one of the projects that we have coming up is a deceptive practices complaint. Okay, this is African Americans in DC, right? This is the ground zero for where we should think black people should be successful in internal labor markets. Not good. Okay. This is Barack Obama's house, okay, in Chicago, which costs $1.9 million. Okay, here's why this house is up there. Because the reason that we should care about this, everyone, public interest students, probably a lot of you public interest students, how many of you think you're going to go to public interest? Okay, right, of course, because you are. Okay, so why is this, how people do in elite law firms, why should you care, right? Why should you care about that? Why is that an important public interest, besides the sort of moral, like, yes, everyone should be treated equally and it's not fair, right? Why is it a public interest issue? This is a serious question. Okay, go ahead. Huh? Okay, well, there's that. But think about the house. Why do I have a picture of a house? Why is it a public interest issue?
They give us a lot of money.
Well, no. Okay, it's a public interest check because of the wealth effects in the minority community of becoming an equity partner. Okay? If you go to law school and you take on $150,000 in debt, right, and then at some point you hit the glass ceiling, right, then the wealth effect in the minority community, right, of making that $2.9 million a year that the equity partners, right, made, that big payoff, that will not come your way. Now, you may do what Michele Obama did, and you may go to government, and then you may go in-house at a client at like University of Chicago, and you'll do fine, okay? You'll do fine. But unless you have a husband who wrote a giant best-selling book, right, you're just going to do fine, right? You're not going to get the $2 million house, and your neighborhood isn't going to get the benefit of your $2 million house, and it isn't going to get the benefit of all that income and the tax base and everything else. So there are significant wealth effects in the minority community that are not being achieved, right? People come to law school because careers open to talents, right? But they're being stopped from, okay, so enough with that. Huh? Yes, and now I'm going to stop. Okay, and that's it. Okay, so.
I want to remind our panelists that we are running over schedule, so please take the time, keep her seriously.
Yeah, but we were running over schedule before we stood up. Okay. In fairness to me.
Okay, so Eric and...
Right. So Eric and I are a tag team, and I'm gonna go first without slides. Then Eric is gonna be the embodiment of the PowerPoint later. I'm not sure how I ended up on the panel on interventions because I'm constantly throwing out the idea of writing a book called The Musings of a Cynical Social Psychologist. So I will hopefully have something to say about interventions, but I won't start there. I'd also like to be explicit about what I do and what I think the role of the kind of science that I do is in this kind of debate. There's been a lot of discussion about that. I'm a social psychologist. I'm a quantitative empiricist. I don't believe that science is somehow the truth. I do believe that it has persuasive power because people treat it as if it's the truth. So the work that I've been doing is on whiteness, so I'm interested in white folks. I'm a black man that studies white people. And then I'll explain exactly how that is in a second. But I want to be explicit. There are a lot of people who do interesting work in this area. We find that work, people who work with me, very inspiring. And so we don't see this as somehow an attempt to justify the theoretical work that's been done. We see it as increasing the persuasive power of that work by adding some empirical basis to it, right? So that's what we do. And so what we've basically been arguing is that colorblindness works to create and maintain white advantage, but it also works to helps whites manage the psychological burdens and moral demands associated with the advantage that accrues to them as a function of their group membership. And I want to be clear here that I mean advantage, and I'm not talking about the inequity in society because it appears from my research that people distinguish between disadvantage and advantage. Okay, so it looks as if whites are willing to acknowledge that there's disadvantage in society. The society is not fair, but what they have a problem with is the existence of advantage that accrues to them as a function of their group membership. And what a lot of our empirical work seeks to do is examine what the consequences would be of making that advantage explicit. So how would that shift the burden associated with the inequity that's societal, that's all of ours? How would that shift the psychological burden if we made explicit advantage instead of focusing on the disadvantage of minority groups? So as an example of the psychological burden, the shift that can occur is a function of how you describe that burden, whether you describe it in terms of advantage or disadvantage. Take, for instance, the effect of disengagement. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, there's a lot of empirical work that shows that minority group members tend not to associate their sense of self with their performance in academic settings. Okay, so there's this disengagement, this disconnect between their experience of self and their performance in these domains, which is detrimental to their performance long term. And it appears as if there's also evidence to suggest that this is tied to their perceptions of inequity in that domain. That is, the more you perceive the domain to be inequitable, the less likely you are as a minority group member to tie your sense of self to performance in that domain, to persevere in that domain, to perform well in that domain. Okay? And so I think of this as a burden of the inequity in society. Whites, on the other hand, even when they acknowledge that inequity exists in society, are still willing to tie their sense of themselves to that domain. Right? They still feel good when they perform well and feel bad when they don't perform well, and hence maintain some sense of motivation. And this is surprising because the psychological explanation for disengagement is that the inequity makes it difficult for you to determine whether or not your performance reflects on the self. Right? So if you're a minority student in the classroom, you don't do well, you don't know why you didn't do well, hence your performance cannot be an indicator of something about you, and you disengage your sense of self from that domain. That's the argument. But in that argument, white should express the same sorts of behaviors. If I'm a white man and I'm sitting in the classroom, I get a good grade. How do I know? It's because I'm a good student and not because I'm white. Right? Shouldn't I also have some problem with the inequity in that situation? And the answer is no, they don't find evidence of that. So again, even when whites acknowledge the existence of inequity, they still tie themselves to performance in that domain. Well, what we do is we actually make explicit white advantage when we tell them, look, there's evidence of societal advantage that benefits whites. All of a sudden, whites don't tie their sense of self to performance in that domain anymore. So now they're carrying a burden associated with the inequity in society that before they didn't have, even though they recognized the inequity was there. So again, not talking about race may not be simply maintaining the disadvantage, but it's also masking the advantages and thereby removing the psychological burden associated with inequity that whites would normally have to carry. And when I also say moral demands, so now I'm going to move and give you another empirical example. So people want to feel good about themselves. People want to feel like good people. And how do people decide if they're good people or not? Well, they have these ideas in mind about what it means to be a good person. In the context of academics, meritocracy is what counts. The smarter I am, the better my test scores, the better person I am, right? If my outcomes are good, I deserve them, et cetera, et cetera. And so whites, though, seem not to be too worried about the fact their outcomes are particularly good, even though inequity exists, and even though they espouse strong belief in meritocracy. And again here, I'm going to have to stop shortly. And then here, to give Eric, my PowerPoint man, a chance to set up. Here I'd argue it's again because they don't understand themselves as benefiting, right? And so what happens if you tell them they benefit, because they have internalized the idea of meritocracy, it hurts their sense of self. So if you tell a white person, look, you benefit from being white, because they believe meritocracy is the way the world should operate, their sense of self, their self-esteem decreases. And the way they manage that, or way sometimes they manage that, is by actually increasing their support for policies that hurt their outcomes. So this is interesting. They do not increase their support for policies perceived to help minorities or the disadvantaged. It's not a concern for justice. It's a concern for their sense of self as moral. Right? So in essence, once they understand that they're advantaged, they must manage what that means in terms of their moral sense of self. Right? They don't have to manage the inequity in terms of what it means societally. They have to manage what it means for them. And that's one way in which we try to use ideological jiu-jitsu to get them to support policies they're not really particularly supportive of, but they are supportive of their own sense of self. Right? So there's a way in which we're trying to use this need to feel good about the self, not to promote a desire or concern for justice to other people's outcomes, but concern for their own behaviors and their own outcomes. And so, in transitioning to what Eric is going to talk about, I think that one of the takeaways that we have from this is that colorblindness plays very important roles in the minds of white folks. Not only does it help them materially, but it also helps them manage the cost, the psychological and moral cost associated with that advantage. It helps mask that. And so given that, it's an important ideology to maintain, and what Eric is going to talk about now is the lengths to which they might go to maintain that ideology, given the power it possesses.
Thank you, Brian. There's been a lot of comment upon this individual's sort of shadow participation in this conference. A lot of speculation, explicitly and indirectly, about the effects of Barack Obama's election on the trajectory of race and racial progress in this country. We had the opportunity to collect some data on a related question, and that is, how do everyday folks interpret the implications of the election of Barack Obama, and how did different interpretations of the significance of his election to leader of the free world, how did that affect their voting behavior? So we basically asked, why did people who voted for Obama vote for Barack Obama, and how, more specifically, did the vote for Barack Obama align with different sorts of intergroup motivations? Was a vote for Barack Obama an effort on the part of individuals with anti-egalitarian sentiments and desires, desire to attenuate intergroup hierarchy? Was it an effort on their part to bring down the racial power structure? Or perhaps, and I think this might be a possibility that resonates with a lot of the people in the audience, was it actually something that resonated with individuals with relatively pro-hierarchy, or an orientation to sort of have a desire to increase the intergroup hierarchy? And we sort of approached this by saying yes, it is both of those things. And I'm just going to blow through some data really quickly where we tried to explore the kind of complex effects on individuals' desire for hierarchy on voting behavior. This is a structural equation model in a longitudinal study that we ran. We had four assessments, 2 before the election, 1 a couple weeks before, 1 right before, and then there were 2 assessments after the election, where time 3 is actually who did you vote for, and time 4 I'll get to if time permits. And desire for hierarchy was assessed using Prado and Sedanis's social dominance orientation scale. And the 2 sort of beliefs on the side are 2 sort of bodies of sort of myth about Barack Obama that we found to be important to people. One, that he's a foreigner, he's unpresidential, socialist, black, radical, Muslim, all these kinds of memes that we saw floating around. And another interesting one that I don't have time to go too far into is that he was a sexist. He's a sexist and treated Sarah Palin and Hillary before her in a sexist manner. And how did that affect the likelihood of voting for Obama? And we see kind of what you'd expect to see from a traditional social dominance perspective, where if you have a strong desire for hierarchy, you embrace nefarious ideas about Barack Obama, and that in turn depressed your likelihood of voting for Barack Obama. If you look at these indirect effects, they basically amount to a pattern in which a desire for hierarchy results in a lower tendency to vote for Obama. Not that surprising, probably, to social psychologists at least. But once you account for those influences through those belief clusters, we did see a highly significant positive effect of desire for hierarchy, social dominance orientation, on the likelihood of voting for Barack Obama. And so the rest of our effort was spent trying to sort of figure out how this was going on. So who is driving this effect, and what ideologies are responsible for this effect? Because clearly, for some people, a desire to maintain the hierarchy is compatible with voting for Obama. In fact, for them, the stronger the desire, the more likely to vote for Obama. So we asked what ideologies that they hold that render voting for Obama compatible with a desire for hierarchy. And we sort of used this idea that many people may have had, that the election of Barack Obama ushers in a post-racial utopia, a colorblind Garden of Eden kind of thing. And we assessed that with some different items. To what extent do you think the U.S. should continue to study race relations, or that we should? To what extent does the election show that race relations are no longer a problem? And to what extent does it mean that we live in a colorblind society? And what we basically find is that positive association, that affinity between the desire for hierarchy and the likelihood of voting for Obama is driven by a subset of people in this study, specifically people who believe that a vote for Obama kind of equals colorblindness is achieved. Bill Bennett sort of encapsulated this well when asked by Anderson Cooper what the election of Barack Obama means. He basically says, and he said it rather gleefully, well, you know what this means? It means that we don't have to listen to excuses anymore. We don't have to listen to anybody talking about inbuilt this and that, he put it. So for him, what the election of Barack Obama meant was that we can finally stop talking about race. And you know, I don't have to convince any of you here that that's a hierarchy-enhancing point of view. Just to sort of get a little bit, 30 seconds, deeper into the psychology of people for whom voting for Obama was compatible with their desire for hierarchy. We replaced you'll all remember the oath of, somebody muffed the oath of office a little bit. And if you were following the right-wing blogs at all, you'll find out that a lot of people thought it was Obama. So what we find is that sort of just replacing our dependent variable for likelihood of voting for Obama with Obama botched the oath the same people who show that positive relationship between a desire for hierarchy and voting for Obama show positive relationship between the desire for hierarchy and saying that he botched the oath. So this will be my final slide. Among people who hold this ideology that Obama equals everything is awesome, we see a positive association between their desire for hierarchy and the likelihood of voting for Obama. Simultaneously, those same people, to the extent that they have hierarchy-enhancing sentiments, blame him for screwing up the oath, which I think basically shows that this was kind of a nose-holding exercise for people who are high in social dominance orientation, and a very sophisticated one at that, because they're essentially saying, okay, I'm going to hold my nose and vote for a member of the subordinate group. That doesn't come naturally to me if I'm high SDO. But I'm going to do it with an eye to what this means for the society. It means that finally I get to deny that we see color in this country. And in reaction to something that Howie said, you pointed out that hegemony requires sort of concrete concessions to members of the subordinate group. And it could be that people with a desire for hierarchy see this as one such concrete concession, however unpleasant or unnatural it makes them feel. So, sorry I went over that.
So when I found out that I was put on the panel as on interventions, the scientist in me went, uh-oh, because as a scientist, I'm very cautious. A lot of times I'm not even convinced by my own data, and I need to do another study. And so a natural question people ask me when I present my research is like, well, how can we use it? And my first answer is cautiously, because I think it's just not focusing on what my data can tell you, but also what you cannot tell from the data, what the data doesn't answer. And I think that's a lot of people like to take the data and run away with it if it is inconsistent with what they want to say. But in thinking about sort of colorblind policies, I was thinking about, well, what do we know in psychology, and what does it say about colorblind ideologies? And one of the things that they were talking about yesterday was when you have a colorblind ideology, what you want to do is separate race from the decisions that you make. So for example, in admissions decisions, you either want to not know the race of the applicant, or if you do know the race, not use it in deciding whether or not you accept them or not. So then I started to think, well, is this possible? Basically, there are two issues you want to know. First of all, is it possible to really not know the race of somebody and make an accurate judgment? And as I thought about it, I thought, well, that is not really possible. I mean, Cheryl put up that slide yesterday with Obama, and just taking out all sort of the racial references, anything that would tell the reader what his race is in his personal statement, changes the meaning entirely of the statement. So really, it's not possible to not know the race of a person, and especially for minorities, because taking race out of a personal statement for someone who's a minority is a very different experience than for someone who's a majority, where race may not play as much of a day-to-day experience for them in terms of determining what kinds of experiences they have. So then I thought, okay, well, so it's not possible to not know the race of somebody. Well, if it's not possible to not know the race of somebody, is it possible to not let knowing the race of somebody affect your decision? And then that's where it took me to the work of social psychologists. And the work, I can't say it's not possible, but the work seems to suggest that it is not possible to let it not, there's a lot of negatives, affect your decision. And there's a lot of work that seems to suggest this, because cues that signal identity are everywhere. I mean, even in this room right now, me sitting in front and as a panelist cues my identity as an academic, as a researcher, as a psychologist. And so you can't get away from these kinds of cues. And a lot of times these cues will affect your behavior without your even knowing it. And social psychologists have collected a lot of data to demonstrate this effect. For example, we did one study where we had people interact with somebody else over email. And everybody knew that this person that they're interacting with, her name was Emily Chen. So they knew she was female, and they knew she was Asian. And as they're interacting, Emily Chen, who's a fake person, sort of divulged a lot of information about herself. She was an undergraduate. She told her what her SAT scores are. And as they were interacting, we had people interacting with her in one of three conditions. One where we emphasized her Asian identity, so her email username was chen@harvard.edu. Another one where we emphasized her female identity, emily@harvard.edu, or neither, AC. And what we found was just something as simple as a username changed the way they remembered her. So the people who saw her, interacted with her as Chen, even though they knew she was Emily Chen, they remembered a higher SAT score for her, a math SAT score, a lower verbal SAT score for her. When they knew that when they interacted with her as Emily at harvard.edu, they remembered a higher verbal SAT score and a lower math SAT score. And so even though they actually got objective information about what her SAT score was, they were sort of framing their memory of her in line with the social expectations and stereotypes. There's also a lot of those stereotype threat studies where if you make a person's racial identity salient before they take a test, their performance falls in line with the stereotypes associated with the test. And we did this study with Asian American females. Asians are stereotyped to be good at math. Women are stereotyped to be bad at math. And when we made their Asian identity salient before they took the math test, they got higher math scores. When we made their female identity salient, they got lower math scores. So these identities are affecting their behavior, and none of the participants in any of these studies knew that we were evaluating them based upon these identities. And this one last study I'm going to tell you about looks at men and women. We have groups of men and women come in and work together on a task. And this task is like building boxes, folding paper, building boxes, and making it into a structure. What we did was we told half of these pairs, we just called this task, we didn't the building task, we referred to it as the building task, and half of the pairs we referred to it as an arts and crafts task. And then we just wanted to see who took charge in this pair. And what we found is when we referred to it as a building task, the male partner was more often the first one to contradict their partner, and the male partner was often the one to be the first one to make the suggestion. But when we referred to it as the arts and crafts task, it flipped. Now the female partner was the one more often contradicting her partner, and the female partner was the one who was more often the one to make the first suggestion. So what people were doing in these cases were they were taking cues from the social environment, just the name of the task or email username, to give them guidance as to how they're supposed to behave. So again, this is happening automatically and outside of their awareness. So when I think about this in terms of colorblind policies, if it's not possible not to know somebody's race, well, it's also kind of very difficult for people not to be affected by this without their, in making their decisions. The other issue I was thinking about with regards to colorblind policies is whether or not ignoring race could also you might lose prospects for benefits associated with race. Because in our studies, it's not always negative stereotypes, but there are positive stereotypes that are out there as well. So in our studies, what we found is, for example, Asian Americans, they get a boost in their performance when we make their Asian identity salient before taking a math test. We've also done studies where we bring athletes in, and we ask them we bring them in, and there's a pile of books on the table, and the RA has a fake cast on. And these are student athletes, and what we did was, for some of them, we made their athletic identity salient by filling them a questionnaire about varsity experiences. And for others, we made their student identity salient by filling out questions about student life. And the RA would come in and it's like, oh no, there's a pile of books on the table. Can you help me lift these books away? And what we found was students who had their athletic identity made salient would heft a lot more books than the students who had their student identity made salient. So what you get is higher expectations and boosts in performance. It's possible also that ignoring race altogether and not categorizing people by race could lead us to lose these benefits as well. And it's not just for the people who are the target of the identities. We did one study where we actually exposed white students or non-Asian students to stereotypes about Asians. So they subliminally saw words like chopsticks, kimono, Chinatown, And they also showed an increase in their math performance. So it's not just for the people for whom you are the target. So I guess in conclusion, I was thinking about, well, maybe what we're doing is not framing the question correctly, or we might think about an alternate way to frame the question, rather than whether or not we should divide people into different categories, or whether or not we should divide people based on race. The question might be focusing on the social stereotypes or the judgments associated with race. So recognizing that there are differences, but focusing on how we are interpreting or judging these differences. And that's all I had to say.
First, I want to say how pleased I am to be here. This has been a fabulous 2 days, as I expected it to be, and it's just a pleasure to be here. What I am going to try and do, and I want to warn everyone up front, I love to use being here as an opportunity to think about new things, and so you're going to be my guinea pig of sorts. So I will also try and abide by the time and see if I doubt I will end up exactly where I intend, but I will give it a try. What I am looking at in this project, it's called More Intelligent Design, is in the context of this conference, I'd say a colorblind intervention at the beginning that has racial implications and very substantial ones that, of course, I'm aware of. But the way it fits, I think, also into the conversations we've just had is a major framing with respect to intellectualism, intelligence, and again, I don't have to say to this group how that has racial implications. So to be more specific, what I am thinking about in this project is the use of social science not by lawyers at first blush, which has been a lot of what we've talked about, but I'll get back to lawyers, of course, impossible for me not to, but the use of social science by universities, and then ultimately maybe by their lawyers, and the legal and policy implications of that, and that's what I doubt I will have time to talk about. I actually have one of my students from my intelligence testing in the law class here, and so I will apologize in advance for not getting to the law. But what I want to start with is that we have a typical set of criticisms of highly selective universities, and we know that this is not that's not all universities in the country. We're talking about a very small percentage, a relatively small percentage of universities, but those are the ones that really seem to dominate the dialogue, particularly the dialogue with respect to who is critiqued for how they choose to select. And so I just put up a couple of kind of the major types of critiques that they are victim to, at least if you take from my perspective. I'm presenting what I think is a way that they can engage with social science and use it more explicitly to defend themselves against such critiques. So the critique being that what you engage in is a sob story sweepstakes, that your system lacks transparency. We have no idea how you decide who to pick, that you are racist. That you actually, you're racist against whites and Asian Americans, some Asian American groups, because of how you choose to admit individuals, that this is really cutting in the merit line. All of these probably just point back to the last, which is the critique is you're deviating from a merit-based rank ordering, I would add. So how do universities respond? I would say that they respond, I like what a panelist before me said, diversity rhetoric, so I'll just use that. That's not what I had. But we know that there's something more substantial to that. But the notion that the response is, and there's a legal reason for this, but that diversity is essential to education. And these are all at different levels. But that the holistic review that universities, especially universities that no longer have, who no longer are using race, but that engage in holistic review. But we know that elite universities across the board engage in some form of holistic review, meaning they don't admit students. I don't think any of them would say they admit admit the students based on rank order, if you're talking about an undergraduate institution, SAT score, or rank order based on LSAT score. So to the extent they're not doing that, they're engaged in some type of bringing in other information. And then, I've added these last two. How do they respond? I would say that they respond by engaging with other goals that they are meeting, that there's a societal obligation, we have a mission to admit based on other criteria other than rank order merit-based selection and or rank order test scores. We're being altruistic to people for some of the issues that have been raised before that are contextualized, and I will certainly acknowledge are very important. So, and what is this against the backdrop of? These responses are against a backdrop, and I think this is the problem with these responses. They exist in a context where the common societal understanding of intellectual merit is that it can be measured, that it can be measured much the way you can measure temperature. And in fact, psychologists that engaged in creating IQ tests, at least the earlier iterations of them, we're engaged in it for that very purpose, to create a way of, a mechanism of measuring in a very precise way the human mind. And I think we can contrast this, and I'm not going to get into this in a great level of detail, but we can contrast this with, I think, what psychometric theorists would say and what test theorists would say as to what they actually claim they're capable of doing. And that is indeed where I think the type of response goes. This slide is here just to be representation of the notion that I think most people, a lot of people have a sense that it is possible to, this is the common understanding, that we could line people up by their merit, by their intellectual capacity. And whereas what is really at play is that there's correlations like we've seen in many slides beforehand, and that to the extent tests are capable of measuring what intelligence is, that there is some variation in that. But there's the psychometric test theory, how the experts would say these tests do this. And what it translates into in the psychometric world are numbers like these correlation numbers. And we know that tests don't have, IQ tests, SAT, LSAT, don't have perfect correlation with outcomes. The typical outcome being your first year grades in undergrad or law school, that and 25% would be a very generous, I think, correlation or variance for these tests, but that there's a relatively small amount, as the common, I think, layperson would think, if something predicts, it would predict at a very high level, that at least over 50%, maybe even in the 80s or 90s. But once you would sit down with the expert and explain what we mean when we say this is a good, reliable test, reliability, validity, all these terms have a very different common sense usage than their technical usage. So to the extent that I am making a suggestion as to how universities could change the frame and have the power to alter that frame, is to present, instead of what they currently present, a more coherent, both theoretical and empirical rationale for what they do. This is where I should point out that everything I'm talking about is within a very limited paradigm. A limited paradigm where I'm going to accept that there is a such thing as objective intellectual merit that could be measured. And Daria has written some amazing things that make the point why that is highly contested. But for the purpose of this project, I'm going to take that as a given, and even take as a given that what we're going to try and correlate things to is your first year grades at a particular institution, which I think is also another piece of what universities could bring to light. And I see by being here that I think, if a decade ago, I don't know if as many people knew that fact as it seems to be from being here today. So that universities, by actually choosing to explain their rationale for their policies in a more explicit, instead of this ad hoc, altruistic, holistic way, to actually engage with social science and to engage with different theories of intelligence would be transformative to what is a major frame that has underwritten a lot of what we've spoken about today. And so by bringing to the fore things that are rather simplistic and known to people in the field, to people outside of the field, I think that could have a tremendous impact. So just right here are conceptualizations of theories of intelligence. And to the extent they are, that there's more than one, that is something that I think the lay person may find interesting. That the notion of G, a general factor of intelligence, and this is just my visual representation of it, it's correlated to all these different variables, or Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence, which we have heard of, but what does it mean and how does it compare to a notion of G? And this is not a really good representation, but there's a triarchic theory of intelligence as well. That to the extent there are these different theories, to one, know that they're out there, that there's Spearman's two-factor theory of intelligence called G is mental energy, that there's hierarchical theories of intelligence, G is at the top of the hierarchy, that there's system theories of intelligence, which the last two that I mentioned would fall into that category. To the extent those exist, and intelligence tests are related to achievement tests, or at least we put them all together. What does this all mean, and how does this relate to my point? Is that to the extent that the average, and this is why I'm so glad to be here, this is something that I want to probe more, but if it is a given or a really commonly understood within those who are more expert, I'd say than lay people, but within either cognitive psychology, philosophy, whatever fields have come together to define intelligence, if the notion, okay, I've run out of time, if the notion of, 30 seconds, if the notion of G is either highly contested or we've moved past some of these theories of intelligence, maybe especially the first one, the notion that G is really the only significant component of intelligence, and the notion that intelligence can be measured as precisely as temperature, that bringing that information to the fore, and someone said that they had visuals that were violent and they found it problematic to present them. I almost find these problematic to present, but I think they're here in the room already. So the notion that both G exists and that there is a test score gap that is reflected by these bell curves, that there are differences by race, differences by gender, that's already part of what is the common understanding of intelligence. And so these are just visuals that represent this. Again, by bringing out these notions that there are different theories, that you could use these theories as an institution to actually respond to allegations of cheating, allegations that your admissions process is non-meritocratic. And here's the current paradigm, that rank order admissions based on measures of presumably probably intelligence, test scores, your composite score, as ETS spits it back to you based on the equation they made for your school, that the current paradigm is that you're the most qualified, you're the best test taker, you're the most intelligent, you're the most meritorious. Those things don't equal diversity. Why don't they? Because of those bell curves I just showed you. And to the extent those exist, that's the presumption. And I couldn't resist myself. Here's a visual of what we know, that admissions, here are all the other folks, but if you don't get in, it's his fault. Back to the correlations, what is interesting, yeah, I like that. What's interesting here is that to the extent there are both these other theories out here, and this is where I will end my talk, that I said theoretical rationales as well as empirical rationales. I think if we take a theory like Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence, where it doesn't have resonance, I think, in a society that we will all acknowledge is very much at this point attracted to numbers. I mean, attracted to empiricism. To the extent Howard Gardner does not engage in empirical research to try and validate his theories of intelligence, his ways of measuring intelligence to first-year grades, it doesn't resonate. He doesn't make it over the hump for those of us who intuitively go, oh, I respond to that. But how does a university operationalize that? The fact that there are system theories of intelligence, and this is something, again, I think people in this world, the experts, they know a lot about. But this interdisciplinary conversation is about bringing that, again, I'm pointing to the institution, the universities, as those who are capable of doing that, saying, there's this other guy out there, and he's trying to, and has been successful in correlating a different version of these tests, a systems theory-based set of tests. He correlates them to first-year grades, and at least at the first blush, they correlate as well, and in some cases better than the SAT. And then here's the kicker. They do it with less of a racial gap in scores. So what do you do with that information? And so that's my point, basically, is that the universities, and to the extent this is about interventions, I think all of us, by knowing this information, by sharing this information, by engaging in these different theories of intelligence, basically it's an opportunity to take what intelligence theorists know and psychologists know, that there's not a uniformity of understanding as to there's something G and that G can be ranked and we're all rank ordered. And to the extent that rank ordering does not equal merit necessarily, to the extent that your university engages in other types of admissions criteria and uses them, that actually that is a quest for true merit. That is a quest for truly finding intelligence, again within this frame that that's what we care about, that we put all these things together, and I'm kind of cheating here at the end, but to create or to at least explain why an institution within our legal context of having a First Amendment, the First Amendment liberty to engage in all sorts of decisions based on their mission, could actually embrace an alternative paradigm, but to do so in the context of connecting that again to some sort of coherent versus ad hoc theory and some empirical research that connects to something that has meaning. What I am not saying, and I hope this is a lesson that I've learned from our time here, is in order to do this, hopefully it's not necessary to say that what is real. We don't even have to know who has the right theory of intelligence. It's just to engage with the fact that it's contested. And so to the extent the common understanding is that this is a given, this is all known, that by having that conversation, that could have legal implications and policy implications and be useful to institutions that are defending themselves.
Okay, so wonderful comments by all the panelists. I'm going to throw a couple questions at them, but I want to make sure that I save enough time for Q&A with the audience. So I think there's a theme that cuts across at least 3 of the talks, and I could strain and try to connect them all, but I'm not going to do that because I hate when people do that. So I think one theme in terms of a potential obstacle to the interventions that were suggested is the question of motivation. Right, so for Rick, how do we motivate people to break from racial norms and cross racial lines? For Michele, how do we motivate white men to pressure firms and sort of join this movement that you started, to pressure firms to make black partners, Latino partners, et cetera, when this would ultimately mean, especially in this economy, fewer white partners being made? So it's sort of against their interests, right? And for Kim, how do we motivate, and I realize I'm asking the law professors the questions, but that's again how my brain works, I guess. So how do we motivate universities to reduce their reliance on standardized tests when they can always argue 209 made me do it? All right, so I have another question, but why don't we start with that?
How can we get universities to decrease their reliance on standardized tests when they can always argue that Prop 209 made me do it? I would say by having the conversation. I think that's where I am. And that's the other the work that took me away from this project for quite some time, which is to, as lawyers, to identify what anti-affirmative action laws like Prop 209 really actually do require institutions to do and what they do not require them to do, what they still maintain the discretion to do, and really point the finger back at the institutions and say, to the extent there is a lack of any form of diversity, because you, unlike, let's say, in other realms, maybe an employer, that universities have been given by the Supreme Court much more leeway, and I don't think they're maximizing their leeway. And so I would say that it may not be a matter of we can't sue to get more racial diversity per se. I think we certainly can, and that's what I've said in other contexts, that from a anti-discrimination perspective, to the extent that an institution is admitting so few African Americans and Latinos that they fall below what keeps them safe from being subject to a Title VI anti-discrimination case, I think that's one thing that can be done, to point that now with the current administration that's a real threat. So I think that would be one thing. But I think to actually point back to that these big framing issues are still at play. And so that may just be a form of a public shaming of sorts, but to just say that, I think we saw a real admission yesterday, and I think that's positive that you're moving at least this institution in a direction where you have a general counsel that will say that's not hiding behind Prop 209 made me do it. So I guess I would give me the same answer that I had with others, which is to again keep putting the same issues out to the fore and not be afraid to talk about these questions of assumptions of Black and Latino intellectual deficit.
Great, thank you.
I guess I would just say it's a great question, but I'm agnostic on the question of are they motivated by liberal guilt or are they altruistic? And in fact, since most of the white students, I have a very, very diverse leadership for BBLP, and I invite you to go to our website and look at the leadership. This is a picture of our leadership in this moment in time, and the organization was actually started by two white men, one gay and one not gay. So I'm not going to get into like false consciousness, right? You think you're being altruistic, but actually you're, worried about your, guilt and what. I mean, I think it was interesting, but I'll like take whatever I can get. So it's like fine with me, whatever's motivating them. But so I haven't had trouble getting people to show up. But I have to say the tournament to partnership is long, and almost nobody makes partner anyway, right? So in my context, right, they don't. Either they vastly overstate their chances because when they know it's zero sum that somebody's not going to make partner if the Black guy makes partner, they don't think it'll be them. These are Stanford students, okay? You know what I'm saying? Okay, first of all. Or they think that hardly nobody makes it anyway, so whatever. You know what I mean? So, and in order to make these things representative, the number difference is very tiny. So it's like, what, 80% isn't enough for you? I mean, so I don't think in my particular context, I think getting men to advocate for female partnership is much harder, but I didn't talk about that because this is the race conference. But I think getting men to advocate for female partnership is a much trickier question because there it is zero sum, and there we're talking about 50%. And when we start creeping up to like 50%, I think we could have a motivation problem, and that's a question of organizing, that's a question of education, that's a question of, constant, working with people on the issues and working with them in the motivate. Now, of course, it's your wife who's going to make partners, so you will get some of that money, right? So, or maybe she won't divorce you because she's so mad that she didn't get to go to work. But, so there's all kind of ways that you can work with people to educate them and to motivate them. But I haven't had trouble at the student level. I think 7 years out, like, would you be willing to leave your job at Harvard because no Black woman has been fired? You know what I mean? Like, that takes a special level of commitment, right? Would you be willing to quit your job the day before your partnership decision if they don't, or the day after if they don't make a woman partner too? No, right? But when you're a student and you're talking about 12 years away, I think I can get them to show up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just really quickly, so for this idea of connectivity, much of it is physical, at least in the early literature, and so really you could just change the physical landscape. In New Haven, for instance, where it turns out that trees were not being planted in some neighborhoods, and they were being, and there were all sorts of environmental justice issues. But I think actually it's more the social constructions, those conventions that we don't see and people don't understand. So the first step, the first intervention would just be making them clear how these things were guiding behaviors, and then subverting them, showing how arbitrary they are. Very basic. Once people see them, then they may at least take a step in that direction.
Okay, great. So this question is for Margaret and Brian. So coming from a legal perspective, I saw some connections between your talks, and I'm wondering if the phenomena that you describe are related when we talk about sort of revealing white advantage to sort of provoke disengagement with a particular domain, or stereotype boost or threat. I mean, how do those two phenomena speak to each other?
I think that they are related, but I think that I'm interested less in where they overlap and more where they don't. I think I think some of what I'm talking about is automatic, not understood, but I think quite a bit of it is very strongly motivated. And what I'm interested in is how to make those motivations explicit, and making clear to people that there are costs to other people for the advantages that accrue to you. And that's not simply, and I want to say it's not a blind process. There is someone in the room who has some responsibility, and it's you. right? And I think that a lot of the I worry when there's psychology that absolves everyone in the room of responsibility. There's just bad things happening, and somebody should do something about it. Like I want to point some fingers, and I want to implicate people in the inequity that's out there, and I really want to move away a bit from implicating people as bad actors, because I think that's hard. Like, you're a racist and that's why you're responsible, and say, I don't care if you've done anything wrong. You're sitting in the room, you're responsible. That's that. I mean, everybody in this room is responsible. I don't do this because I'm a black man. I do this because I'm interested in social justice. What about you? Where are you at on interest in social justice? Like, and you are a part of the system. You are in an unjust system, and you're benefiting from it in the same way that I'm being disadvantaged from it. That implicates you. You have responsibility. And my goal is to make that explicit, and it's not so much about the misunderstandings, the automatic things that happen that I do think are there, but I'm less interested in that and more interested, again, in making explicit people's personal responsibility for social justice. Everyone should be committed to it.
Great. Margaret?
I guess where we overlap is in raising awareness and making what's implicit explicit. So a lot of times when I first started graduate school, people asked me, well, why do you study what you want to study? And me being naive and over-idealistic, I was like, well, I study this because I want to get rid of racism. But since then, I've sort of toned down and become more realistic. And then my goal now is just to identify some of these implicit processes where we don't know what we're doing is being biased by our social expectations. And if we bring it to people's awareness, people can correct for those. Because now people don't want to think of themselves as racist, and people don't want to think of themselves as biased. So if there's research that finds out, that shows that when people are aware that there are certain things that could bias their behavior, they will correct for those behaviors. So there's also a difference between knowing these stereotypes and actually believing these stereotypes. So they've done studies where they subliminally show people black faces or white faces, and the people who were subliminally shown the black faces would interpret an ambiguous act as more hostile than the people shown the white faces. But when you ask people who are low in prejudice to actually write what they would do when it's within their conscious control, they would replace sort of prejudiced stereotypes with more egalitarian ones. So they will correct if they're aware of it. So I guess ultimately my goal is just to show people where these biases could exist in terms of their behaviors, where they're not aware that they may be acting in a biased way, and give them the chance to correct for it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, so I think we have time for about 2 questions. Andrea?
I have a question that's been kind of floating around my head for the past couple days, and that we're talking a lot about Obama, but at the same time, we're in a recession. And we haven't really talked about the economics right now. I mean, Dari spoke earlier a little bit about locked in, early advantage being locked in, but now in a period of retrenchment where we have credit disappearing at all levels. So whatever might have been an illusory ladder that allowed low-income people of color to climb up the wealth ladder, borrowing on future income, that ladder has been pulled up. So now we're going into a period of retrenchment, economic retrenchment. Are there, and in the past, sometimes those of us, we've used strategies of saying, okay, well now you, white middle-class person, man, are hurting like us, so now are you more sympathetic to our strategies about, redistributing wealth or opportunity or something like that? And that has very limited effect. So now that we're talking about interventions, do you guys have any thoughts about these creative ways to address the fact that those of us, on the bottom economically and politically are about to hurt real bad? And it's only tragic when the poor people are on the food stamps, right? That's what gets in the papers. When the white people get on food stamps, I mean. When it's folks of color, that's pathology. So what can we do in this period of economic retrenchment?
Everybody's looking at me.
Question. Nobody's jumping.
I think I opened this with saying I'm a cynical social psychologist. I want to just reiterate that point. What can we do? I I just want to be clear. It wasn't when I said that I want people to understand that social justice is everyone's responsibility. I'm not optimistic or idealistic about that. I mean, I think of that as an ideological move rather than a plea for help. And so I really, on these conditions, I guess I'm a materialist, and I worry that people's self-interest is going to will trump their psychological interest. So a lot of what I was talking about is really trying to turn people's psychological self-interest against their material self-interest. So in saying that, look, you want to be a moral person, this is what this demands of you, and trying to use that to push against their material self-interest, right? But as material self-interest grows in importance, I don't have a lot of hope that these moral claims are going to carry much weight. I mean, that's the truth. I think it's going to be long, painful, and very hard. That's what I assume. I wish I had a better answer, but also, I mean, history is what it is, and I don't see any reason to hope for something better this time around. So yeah, I wish I want to think of some positive thing to say right now, but
anyone else?
I have a
Yeah.
so yeah, this is really interesting. There's a recent bankruptcy study that was done, and if you had been looking at the bankruptcy data, so home ownership is associated with middle class stability. Everyone knows that, and if you look at white filers for bankruptcy, you'll see that comparing homeowners to renters, if you looked in 2000, you'd notice that white homeowners were about a third as likely to file as white renters. But as early as 2000, if you looked at blacks, you would have noticed that black renters were less likely to file for bankruptcy than black homeowners. And that's because they were getting subprime loans. And something really tragic is, I mean, part of the elevation of and wealth and social and financial capital that accrues, these are some of these advantages of being white, really has worked through this home ownership mechanism. And blacks were excluded from it because of FHA policies and other discriminatory policies. And their attempt, this was a good move for it, but with the subprime crisis, they've actually moved backwards. So I think what we have to do is to pay attention to what's going on. It was just Wednesday, I think, that the Council on Economic Advisors proposed a policy to deal with the subprime crisis, and banks aren't making a move. Everybody wants to protect bondholders. No one's thinking about this. Another generation of exclusion from participation in this important wealth mechanism. So while we focus on the individual and the psychological, we can't lose sight of these bigger structural economic factors, and we should be out there as engaged with what's going on with the policies, these economic policies that are really being decided at this very moment. It's being, if you read the op-eds of the New York Times for the last week, everyone has a different proposal, and most people are talking about how can we protect bondholders, how can we save banks, and that's important. Don't get me wrong, it's part of the important structural fabric, but there isn't a lot of discussion about this consistently excluded community.
Eric?
I was just going to add to what people have said in response to your question. You know, it strikes me that it's kind of a particularly dangerous time for this rhetoric of sort of an actualized post-racial America to be sort of, you know, a popular meme right now, for the reason that we know that the recession or depression or whatever it is going to disproportionately impact people who are not white. And I think that in terms of an intervention, I mean, in thinking about the data that I talked about, I mean, in addition to being a flesh and blood human being, Barack Obama is kind of like a social construction in a way. Like, you know, there's definitely a discourse out there that individuals, especially dominant group members who have a vested interest in maintaining the hierarchy, that they are all too eager to engage in, and that is the sort of Bill Bennett, like, finally we don't have to listen to any of that racism crap anymore, like it's over, which of course we know is just retrenching kind of idea. And so I really think it's important, and I'd like to hear Barack Obama, you know, who I don't believe thinks that for a second that we live in a post-racial world, because he has been elected. I'd like to hear him, help support the and although I'm not, disciplinarily used to using terms like discourse and stuff like that, I'll try it out. To sort of counter that discourse with the discourse of no, that's not what it means. And that's especially important right now because I think for the reasons that you point out, it's especially dangerous time for us to start even entertaining the notion that racial inequality has somehow been erased with the wand that Devin gave Howie yesterday.
I think crisis is really an opportunity too. Let's not forget that. And so I think, I'm not organized. This project doesn't work with people in the low income bracket, obviously, yet. But layoffs have been, really extreme. And I think that, we've been saying for a year, our message is these employers are exploitative, these working conditions are exploitative, that these are sweatshops, that they work on a sweatshop model, and that they treat their workers as disposable objects. And I think that message as an organizing tool to take to law students now has a lot more potential salience with the whole group, including the white men and the white women and everybody, to say, look, look at, they just let you go, they don't care about you at all, and how do you like your $150,000 in debt now? And so there's a real opportunity, but it's not going to make itself because you have to break through the media haze of, pro-capitalism ideology and post-racial, woohoo, let's all sing kumbaya ideology, right? So that's a job. Right? We have to go out and organize in multiracial groups and get people to see that their interests are aligned. People don't just wake up and think, oh, my interests are aligned, right? Left to themselves, they're going to be zero-sum. We have to help them, get there.
Great. That's the final word. Thank you to the panel. I want a special thank you to the faculty organizers of this symposium, Jerry Kong and Cheryl Harris. And to the hardest working man at UCLA Law School, Saul Sarabia.
All right, so,